I still hear the doorbell in my sleep sometimes. It wasn't the cheerful little chime you hear in an ordinary house. It was a deep, echoing sound that rolled through my parents' dining room like thunder, bouncing off tall windows and polished wood. My brother, Blake, sprang up so fast his chair scraped the floor and his wineglass trembled. "That's him," he said, eyes bright with triumph. "That's the investor, the one who just saved our company." My parents leaned forward at the head of the table, smiling like they'd won something. And me? I sat at the far end, the forgotten place setting, my plate barely touched. My name is Evelyn Caldwell, and in my family, I've always been the one they talk over, not the one they listen to. Blake marched toward the front door like a man about to accept applause. He rested his hand on the handle, then glanced back over his shoulder with that sharp little grin he saved for me. Then he pulled the door open. "Before I tell you who was on the other side, do me a quick favor. If you've ever been underestimated by people who should have had your back, family, friends, anyone who decided you were less without knowing your full story, tap like, because you're going to feel this one in your bones, and drop a comment with the word misjudged if you've lived through the moment someone finally realized they were wrong about you. If you want more stories with twists you don't see coming, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this dinner changed everything." The Caldwell name means something in our corner of the Midwest. Most people don't care who owns what until it affects their jobs, their mortgages, their kids' school fees. But in Missouri, especially around St. Louis, our name sits on donation walls, scholarship plaques, and old newspaper clippings framed in office corridors. Caldwell Paper and Packaging started as a small mill by the river decades ago, then grew into a manufacturing network that supplied boxes, cartons, and sustainable packaging to food brands, retailers, and shipping companies across the country. My grandfather used to say, "If you've ever opened a parcel, you've touched our work." He said it with pride, like the company was a living thing he'd raised. Inside my family, though, the company was more than business. It was identity. It was hierarchy. It was the story they told at every gathering. Caldwell men build, Caldwell women support. My mother, Celeste, isn't a villain, but she is loyal to that script the way some people are loyal to a religion. She hosts the dinners, remembers names, smooths tension with a smile, and quietly judges anyone who doesn't fit the mold. My father, Richard, runs operations like an old ship captain who refuses to change course, even when storms shift direction. And Blake? Well, Blake was raised like an heir, not a child. He grew up hearing that the future was his, that leadership lived in his blood, that the company needed a man with instincts. Then there was me. I wasn't loud. I didn't love factory tours. I didn't light up at conversations about machine output and shipping margins. What I loved was systems, how information moved, how small changes could prevent big mistakes, how you could save time and reduce waste without cutting people. In school, I built little programs for teachers to track grades. In university, I studied computer science and data modeling. I honestly thought my family would be proud that I could bring something modern to an old industry. I thought they'd see me as an asset. The first time I tried to help, I was 19. Dad had dragged us to the main plant for a holiday photo opportunity, the sort where everyone wears branded jackets and smiles like everything is perfect. The floor smelled of steam and glue. Supervisors scribbled numbers on clipboards while forklifts moved through the aisles like careful dinosaurs. I watched pallets stack up in the wrong order, watched one worker run back and forth because a label had been printed wrong, watched a manager squint at handwritten notes and guess at the next shipment. That night, at home, I told Dad I could build a simple tracking system that would reduce errors and speed up deliveries. I offered to do it for free. He didn't shout. That would have been easier. He laughed softly, the way adults laugh when a child suggests something cute. "Evie," he said, "we don't need an app. We need experience. Let the grown-ups handle the real work." Blake, 16 at the time and already practicing his smug grin, added, "Yeah, Evie, not everything needs to be turned into a video game." Mum changed the subject the way she always did when emotions sharpened. She offered pie. She asked about my classes. She made it feel normal, which somehow made it worse. That was my first lesson in how this family dismissed me. Gently, politely, with a smile, like pushing a door closed without slamming it. I tried again when I was 23 after an internship in Chicago, where I'd watched a logistics firm save millions using better forecasting. I came home excited, carrying a notebook full of ideas. Caldwell Paper had distribution problems, trucks leaving half full, warehouses stacked in inefficient patterns, late deliveries that strained relationships. I'd mapped solutions. I sat at the same dining table where, years later, that doorbell would ring. Dad listened for about 2 minutes. Then he held up a hand. "Evie, sweetheart," he said, and that word sweetheart was the lock clicking shut. "This is manufacturing, not tech. Don't overcomplicate it." Blake leaned back, arms folded as if he was bored by my existence. "You know what would really help?" he said. "If you'd come work here like the rest of us instead of acting like you're above it." Above it. That word stuck to me like burrs, because I wasn't above anything. I didn't think I was better than anyone. I just wanted to make things better. By 26, I stopped trying to be heard. I graduated, got a job as a software engineer, and moved west. First Denver, then later Portland. Remote work gave me freedom. It also gave me something my family hated: distance. They couldn't drag me into events as easily. They couldn't call me at the last minute to help with hosting. They couldn't use me as a prop in their story. I became, in their minds, the daughter who ran away. And that's the version of me they repeated any time my name came up, which was usually when they wanted to contrast it with Blake. "Blake is so dedicated," Mum would say, pride thick in her voice. "He really understands responsibility." "Blake is learning every part of the operation," Dad would add. "He has the instincts." And then, like an afterthought, "Evie's doing computers." They said computers like it was a hobby, like I spent my days playing games and my nights watching silly videos. They never asked what I built. They never asked who trusted my work. They never asked how much I earned. In their eyes, I stayed small. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I built my own life. I rented a modest flat with a view of gray skies and tall trees. I drove a used car with a scratch down the side. I made friends who knew me as Evie, not a Caldwell. I learned to breathe without feeling judged. But no matter how far away I went, the company followed me, not because I missed the boardroom, but because I knew what the company meant to people who weren't sitting in my family's dining room. I grew up with workers' kids. I knew the faces behind those paychecks. I knew that when the company struggled, it wasn't my dad's pride that suffered first. It was the people on the floor. And the company did start to struggle. It wasn't one dramatic crash. It was a slow squeeze. Cheaper overseas packaging flooded the market. Big clients demanded lower prices and faster delivery. Raw material costs swung wildly. Regulations tightened around sustainability, forcing expensive upgrades. What used to be comfortable margins became razor thin. A couple of contracts slipped away. A machine breakdown that should have been a short hiccup became a cash bleed because the company didn't have modern backups or smart planning systems the competitors had invested in years earlier. I saw it because I read. I've always been the type who reads before speaking. While my family worshipped instinct, I trusted information. Caldwell Paper is private, but there are still industry reports, supplier statements, trade coverage, and enough public data to build a picture if you know where to look. I watched debt rise. I watched reserves shrink. I watched my father accept financing deals that bought time but chained the company tighter to lenders. I watched, and something in my chest tightened like a fist. Then my grandfather died. He wasn't perfect, but he was the only person in my family who ever looked at me like my mind mattered. When I was a child, he'd let me sit in his study and ask questions. He'd show me old maps of plant sites and shipping routes. He'd tell me stories about mistakes he made and lessons he learned. He didn't pretend the company was heroic, but he respected it as something that needed care. In his will, he left most of his assets to my father, and a large portion to Blake, because tradition demanded it. I received what my parents called a sweet little amount, enough for them to feel generous without changing the family's power structure. Dad told me with a pat on my shoulder, "This should help you get settled, wherever you've decided to play house." I smiled, thanked him, and left the room. Then I sat in my car and cried. Not because of the money, but because of the message. Even in death, the family system stayed the same. That inheritance became my seed. I didn't wake up the next day as some genius investor. I made mistakes, big ones. I bought into a trendy energy company because the headlines said it was the future. The future tanked. I tried trading short-term swings because I thought I could outsmart the market. I couldn't. I lost a painful chunk in a few months, the kind of loss that makes your stomach drop when you check your account. That fear did something useful, though. It humbled me. It forced me to stop chasing quick wins and start doing what I was actually good at: analyzing systems, finding patterns, making decisions based on data, not ego. So I built a plan. If Caldwell Paper was going to survive the next decade, it needed investment, real investment, not just loans that kept it breathing while bleeding. Not speeches from Blake about vision. It needed someone willing to step in, provide room to move, and push for smarter decisions. And here's what surprises people. I wasn't trying to take over. Not at first. I wanted stability. I wanted the towns around our plants to stay alive. I wanted the workers to keep their health care and their wages. I wanted my grandfather's work to mean something beyond pride. But I also knew this. If I offered help openly, my family would refuse it. Or worse, they'd take it and still treat me like a child who'd wandered into an adult conversation. So I did what people do every day, quietly and legally. I used privacy structures. I created investment entities that weren't tied to my personal name. I hired a reputable attorney in Oregon named Victor Salazar. Precise, calm, the kind of man who never overpromises and never panics. Everything we did was compliant, taxed, documented. The point wasn't to hide wrongdoing. The point was to keep my family from turning my help into a weapon against me. We began small. A private note purchase here, a short-term financing facility there. When Caldwell Paper issued convertible notes to raise cash for equipment upgrades, one of my entities quietly bought a portion. The board saw an outside investor stepping in. They were relieved. They toasted fresh support. They thanked the universe for good timing. They never thought of me. I kept my job. I kept my life simple. If you'd met me then, you would have guessed I lived like a normal remote engineer. Steady income, modest expenses, quiet routines. I did it on purpose. Not because I was pretending to be poor, but because I didn't want my life to become a performance. Money has a way of turning people into characters. I didn't want to be a character in anyone's story, especially not my family's. Year by year, my position grew. Not overnight. Slowly, carefully. Like adding bricks to a wall in the dark. Whenever the company hit turbulence, I stepped in through another instrument, another entity, another quiet investment. When a major client delayed payments and the company needed cash to cover payroll, I provided a bridge. When new sustainability rules threatened to create a compliance nightmare, I financed upgrades that would turn it into a marketing advantage. When fuel prices surged and shipping costs ate margins alive, I offered a facility that kept deliveries moving. The board loved the mystery investor. They called it a guardian fund in some internal jokes. My father praised this stranger in meetings, according to someone I knew on the admin team. Blake took credit for attracting confidence. My mother bragged at charity events that Richard and Blake have made powerful connections. I heard all of it secondhand and stayed quiet. At some point, my ownership became more than helpful. It became powerful. I crossed thresholds that meant I could influence outcomes if I chose to. I didn't use that power immediately. I just held it. The way you hold an umbrella over someone who refuses to admit it's raining. That's the strange thing about being underestimated. It hurts, yes, but it also creates space. People don't watch you when they think you don't matter. They don't question what you're capable of. They don't ask how you know what you know. In my case, their dismissal became my cover. Still, secrecy has a cost. There were nights in Portland when I stared at my screen long after work ended, watching industry reports about Caldwell paper and feeling my chest tighten. I wanted to call my father and say, "You're making the wrong move." I wanted to call my mother and ask if she was okay, because even through her polite tone, I could hear stress. I wanted to shake Blake and tell him leadership isn't a birthright. But every time I considered reaching out, I remembered how they looked at me when I spoke. The slight smile, the gentle interruption, the way Blake's eyes slid away like I was background noise. So I stayed silent. I built. And then, 3 weeks before that dinner, everything accelerated. A major retailer decided not to renew a packaging contract, not because our product was bad, but because deliveries were inconsistent and the company couldn't guarantee the newest sustainability certifications the client demanded. It was a gap big enough to trigger panic. Suppliers demanded tighter payment terms. Banks pushed back. The board began to argue. For the first time, whispers about leadership competence started spreading, and the whispers pointed in one direction: Blake. Blake had pushed for a flashy expansion, new machinery leased at high rates, a warehouse acquisition that looked great on a slide but drained cash in reality. He'd taken credit when things went well, and now he was scrambling as reality caught up. That's when he decided to host a dinner. The invitation came by email, formal and cold, like a meeting request. Family dinner. Friday, 7 p.m. It included a line about a special guest, and then Blake's personal note: important supporter of the company. Thought you should finally meet someone doing real work for the family. I stared at the screen and felt old anger rise, followed by something sharper underneath. Clarity. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to make me feel small in front of the person he believed was saving him. And I could have ignored it. I could have stayed in Portland, stayed safe in my quiet life. But if the company was that close to the edge, I needed to see it with my own eyes. Not through reports, not through rumors. I needed to look my father in the face and know whether he understood how close the cliff really was. So I replied, "I'll be there." Friday arrived under low clouds, the sky the color of wet concrete. Driving into Missouri always tightened something in my stomach, as if the land remembered every time I'd been dismissed here. The Caldwell house sat outside the city, not quite an estate but close. Large, tasteful, built to impress without looking like it was trying too hard. A long driveway, manicured trees, warm light spilling from huge windows. When I walked in, staff took my coat. Mum hugged me lightly, careful not to wrinkle her own dress. Dad shook my hand like I was a colleague. Blake clapped me on the shoulder a little too firmly and said, "Look at you, Evie, still dressing like you're going to a job interview." I smiled, because sometimes smiling is armor. Dinner began politely. Mum asked about Portland weather. Dad asked about my projects, but his eyes wandered before I finished answering. Blake talked about himself, as always. Meetings, negotiations, pressure. He checked his watch repeatedly in a way that made it clear he wanted us all to notice. Then the digs started. Blake leaned toward me with a grin. "So, still working from home? Must be nice. No real deadlines, no real responsibility." Mum laughed softly. "Blake, don't tease," she said, but her tone carried agreement. Dad nodded, as if Blake had stated a fact. "Some roles are less intense," he said, "but it's good you found something that suits you." I ate slowly, letting their words slide off my face while inside they pressed on old bruises. I watched how they looked at Blake, like he was the sun. I watched how they looked at me, like I was a lamp left on in an empty room. Dessert arrived. Mum's lemon tart, perfect and glossy. Blake lifted his glass. To the future, he said, eyes bright. To the next chapter of Caldwell paper. And to the man who made it possible. He nodded toward the empty chair at the table, the seat reserved for the investor. The chair sat there like a dare. Any minute now, Blake said, and his gaze flicked to me again. You're going to love this, Evie. Maybe it'll inspire you to do something bigger. I set my fork down carefully, because my phone had buzzed once in my pocket. A short message from Victor Salazar. 2 words. On site. My heartbeat stayed steady, but my skin went cold in a way I recognized. It was the feeling right before a storm breaks. Blake stood, smoothing his suit jacket. That'll be him, he said. And as if the house itself was following his script, the doorbell echoed through the dining room. Deep, rolling, impossible to ignore. My brother nearly raced to the foyer, triumphant, ready to greet the hero of his story. I didn't move. I didn't need to, because I had already asked the real guest to come. Blake reached the door, his hand wrapped around the handle. He pulled it open wide, and I rose quietly from my chair and stepped toward the hallway. I saw Victor's dark suit just beyond the threshold, his briefcase held neatly at his side. Blake's smile faltered like a light flickering out. My father's chair scraped back. My mother's breath caught. Victor met my eyes and gave the smallest nod. I slipped my phone from my pocket, thumb hovering over a saved number I knew by heart. I walked back to the table without rushing, placed the phone right beside the untouched dessert plate, and turned the speaker on. My family stared at me like they'd suddenly realized they didn't know who I was at all. I inhaled once, steady and quiet, and pressed call. The line rang once, twice, and then a calm voice answered, crisp and professional, like someone who never gets surprised. Salazar and Klein, Corporate Services. This is Naomi speaking. I kept my voice even. Naomi, it's Evelyn Caldwell. We're ready. There was a short pause, the sound of papers shifting. Then the voice returned, slightly more formal. Understood, Miss Caldwell. Confirming you're requesting a summary of beneficial ownership and voting control for Caldwell Paper and Packaging Holdings, correct? Correct, I said, and I could feel every pair of eyes on me like spotlights. My father's jaw was tight. My mother's hand hovered near her chest. Blake looked between me and Victor in the doorway as if he expected someone to shout, "Prank!" and reset the room. Naomi continued. As of close of market yesterday, the company has 120 million shares outstanding across voting and non-voting classes. The largest voting block, representing 44.3% of voting rights, is held by a group of entities under the beneficial control of Evelyn Caldwell. The words dropped onto the table like a weight. My mother made a small sound, almost a gasp. My father didn't move at first, like his body was trying to refuse what his brain was hearing. Blake's face drained of color so quickly it looked unreal. Naomi went on, steady and precise. The next largest voting block is held by Richard Caldwell at 19%. Other shares are distributed among institutional partners, employee trusts, and minority holders. Based on yesterday's valuation, Ms. Caldwell's controlled shares are valued at approximately $8.6 billion. Silence swelled. It wasn't the dramatic kind you see in films. It was heavier, realer. It pressed against my ears until I could hear my own breathing. Blake finally found his voice, but it sounded thin. No, he said, shaking his head hard. That's not possible. She doesn't. He gestured at me like my clothes proved his argument. She lives in a flat. She drives that old car. She's a programmer. I met his eyes. Yes, I said quietly. I'm a programmer, and I'm also the investor you've been thanking. My father's chair creaked as he sat back down, slower than before, like someone twice his age. Evie, he said, voice rough. This has to be a mistake. It isn't, I replied, and my tone surprised even me because it wasn't angry. It was tired. Every time the company needed breathing room, the money came through my entities. The bridge funding when suppliers tightened terms, the capital for the sustainability upgrades, the facility that kept payroll steady when that retailer delayed payments. My mother's eyes filled instantly, the tears pooling as if she'd been holding them back for years, and my words finally cracked the dam. "Why didn't you tell us?" she whispered. The question hung in the air, fragile and almost childlike, and for a moment I saw the version of her that used to braid my hair when I was small, the version that laughed without calculating what it meant. My throat tightened, but I didn't look away. "Would you have believed me?" I asked. My father's mouth opened, then closed. His silence answered for him. Blake pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair scraping the floor. "This is some kind of stunt," he snapped, reaching for anything that would put him back on top. "You hired a lawyer, got someone on the phone, printed fake charts. Congratulations. You think you can embarrass me?" Victor stepped forward one pace, calm as stone. "The documentation is verifiable," he said. "Registration numbers, filings, contracts. If you'd like, I can show the chain of custody for every instrument." Blake's eyes darted, searching for support. My father looked stunned. My mother looked broken. And Blake, for the first time in his life, looked unsure. I reached to the phone and ended the call before Naomi could keep talking. The confirmation was enough. "Now," my father said slowly, "tell me what you want." His tone tried to regain control, but it wobbled. "If you've done this, if you truly hold that much, what is this about?" I stared at the untouched dessert in front of me, the glossy tart my mother had made with careful hands, and I realized how strange it was that something sweet could sit in the middle of something so bitter. "It's not about what I want tonight," I said. "Tonight was about truth. Tomorrow is about decisions." Blake scoffed, but it came out weak. "Decisions," he repeated, like the word offended him. "You think you can just show up and take everything?" I turned to him. "I didn't show up to take," I said. "I showed up because the company is bleeding and you've been pretending it's a victory lap. You invited me here to make me feel small. But you never bothered to ask who kept the lights on." My mother stood suddenly, her chair sliding back. She came around the table like she wanted to touch me, to prove I was real. "Evie," she said, voice shaking, "please, I don't understand. We thought you didn't care." I swallowed. "I cared enough to stay invisible," I said. My father's hands trembled slightly as he clasped them. "If you're the majority voice," he said, and it looked like the words hurt to form, "then you can call meetings." Victor spoke, gentle but firm. "Yes, she can." Blake's breathing turned shallow. He looked like a man seeing the floor disappear under his feet. "You can't do this," he said, and this time there was fear in it. "Dad built this. I'm next. That's how it works." I leaned forward just a little. "That's how you assumed it works," I said. "But companies don't run on assumptions. They run on accountability." My father stared at me, and in his eyes I saw something new. Confusion mixed with regret. Like he was replaying years of dismissing me and hearing them with different ears. "What happens tomorrow?" my mother whispered. I stood, smoothing my sleeves, and my voice came out calm, almost gentle. "Tomorrow," I said, "we meet the board. We look at the numbers honestly, and we decide who should be trusted with the future." Blake's head snapped up. "You wouldn't," he said. "You wouldn't go that far." I looked at him for a long moment, long enough for him to feel the uncertainty he'd made me feel for years. "You don't know what I would do," I said quietly. "You never did." Victor opened the dining room door for me as if this were any other business meeting. I stepped into the hallway, the air cooler there, less heavy. Behind me, I heard my mother call my name again, softer, pleading, but I didn't turn back. Because somewhere beyond this house, beyond their shock and pride, a boardroom was waiting. And by morning, the Caldwell Empire would learn something my family still hadn't fully understood. The quiet one at the end of the table had been holding the pen the whole time. By sunrise, the boardroom smelled like burnt coffee and panic. Men and women in tailored jackets sat too straight, flipping through printouts like the pages might bite. My father took his usual seat out of habit, Blake beside him, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. I walked in with Victor and a simple folder, nothing flashy. No victory outfit, no smug smile, just facts. If you're still with me, type truth in the comments right now, because the next 5 minutes decided who would control an empire and whether a family could survive it. And if you want the next story, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this lesson goes beyond money. I didn't waste time. I'm calling for a leadership vote, I said, and the room stiffened. One director tried to push back on tradition, another raised concerns about debt and shrinking contracts, and a third asked what my real agenda was. I answered without heat. My agenda is stability, jobs, long-term survival. Then Victor slid the evidence across the table, verified share control, financing history, voting proxies, all compliant. The vote happened fast, like ripping off a plaster. First, my father was removed as CEO. It passed by one vote. He stared down at the table, not angry, just hollow. Next, Blake was removed from all executive roles. That one passed with more breathing room. Blake stood so abruptly his chair fell backward. "You're humiliating us," he snapped, voice cracking. "You're ruining the family." I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't see a rival. I saw a man raised on applause, terrified of silence. "I didn't ruin the family," I said. "The way we treated each other did." In the hallway, my mother found me first, eyes swollen. "Please," she whispered, "don't leave us like this." My father followed, slower, shoulders heavier than I'd ever seen. "I was wrong," he said, and the words sounded like they cost him something. "I didn't listen. I didn't see you." Blake's anger faded into something uglier. Shame. "I thought you were nothing," he muttered, not meeting my eyes. The old part of me wanted to walk away forever. But another part, older, steadier, remembered the workers, the town, the good moments that existed before pride took over. I exhaled. "I'm not doing this to punish you," I said. "I'm doing this to protect what matters." Then I softened my voice. "And I forgive you. Not because you earned it, but because I won't carry this poison anymore." My mother's shoulders shook as she hugged me, and this time I didn't feel like a prop. I felt like a person. I set one condition: respect, honesty, and family therapy. Real effort, not performance. They agreed, quietly. Months later, the company stabilized under new leadership, the workers stayed employed, and my family, slowly, learned a new kind of legacy, one built on humility, not hierarchy. Moral lesson: being underestimated can be painful, but it can also be power. If you stay patient, stay disciplined, and stay kind. And forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's choosing peace over revenge. If you felt that, comment peace and share this with someone who needs to hear it.